So I'd like to call to order the Thursday, June 29, 2023 Business Services Committee meeting. It's 5:35. And I'd like to welcome Mr. Lentz to the microphone. This will be the first committee meeting that for which he runs the agenda. And so I appreciate his commitment to making Business Services Committee run well. So Mr. Lentz.
Thank you, Mr. Lackner. Would you please, our first item on the agenda is citizen comments. Would you please read the statement?
I'd be happy to do so. During the public comment period, members of the public body who wish to speak are asked to first state their name and community in which they reside. Each individual will have up to 3 minutes to address the board on a topic of their choosing. We ask all individuals who address the board to do so with respect and civility towards others. Please note that personnel matters are sensitive and confidential. We also want to inform our speakers that all regular, special, and committee meetings are live streamed and available for viewing at any time on the district's YouTube channel. Personal information should be considered before making a statement that will be recorded and made public. While the board will not respond to today's public comment during this meeting, we are committed to listening to you to help support our work for the district and on behalf of our students, staff, families, and community members. Thank you.
Do we have any citizen comments? Calling up Dirk Remley.
Good evening again. Thank you, Mr. Lentz, and congratulations on running your first meeting. That's very amazing. I spoke at the last meeting earlier in June. Some of you may remember me, and I was putting forward my voice saying I oppose the Lincoln Elementary kind of transfer and shuffle. And this might be just me as a lawyer or me as a parent or me from my time when I worked at Apple, where I was just like, I don't like being someone who just says, I oppose this. I believe it's important to actually come to the table with possible solutions and try to bring things and at least present my opinions with something constructive going forward. And that's what I'd like to put forward coming right now. Obviously, did a lot of research, went back into a lot of the PowerPoints over the last, I believe this has been going on for 6 months to a year, this plan about the shuffle. And a couple of my concerns obviously are the heat map. I was a little bit more interested in just because of my personal experience in my neighborhood. It showed pre 5 years old as no families there, whereas I personally know of about 4 or 5 families just in my local area. Anyway, moving forward with it, kind of my nervousness around this is we are spending $15 million for a shuffle and essentially updating Lincoln to an admin building. I believe there are ways that $50 million could be avoided. One, by either doing a little bit more of a shuffle, doing things along the lines of, I know we already have kind of an intermediate elementary school going with Davis and Richmond. That could be done with Lincoln as well. Honestly, we could probably save money by keeping Lincoln as an elementary and doing an intermediate school with Fox Ridge, or if we really did need to do something with the Haines Center, could bring this up to compliance and be able to do kind of intermediate or vice versa, something along those lines. I think that would cut down costs immensely on it because we won't have to bring obviously Lincoln up to ADA compliance, which we know is the largest factor in why it's going to cost so much for this plan, for the $15 million plan. Secondly, if we are really thinking, trying to think outside the box, me personally, from living in that neighborhood, I know the city owns property all the way, not just onto the boulevard. Sorry, I probably should stay close to the microphone. It's a lawyer in me. I like to pace around, not just to the boulevard, but usually all the way into the sidewalk across the street. That's how far the city owns the property into that. That area of 6th Avenue is not essential. It's not a through street. It's not anything. I'm putting it out there that we could close down just the street in front of that. You could spend $15 million and build a 2-story building on the front. You wouldn't have to make the rest of Lincoln ADA compliant, because it won't be touching that 30% of the building. And you'd be building a new building for children, which is obviously what we're all hoping for, is something best for the children to keep things going. And a better way to spend $15 million. Obviously, this is me just spitballing, going through, doing some research and trying to figure out stuff. I really appreciate what you all do. I'm going to keep doing this, coming up with things. But again, thank you for everything. Mr. Gordon, go Nuggets, right? Yeah. So, all right. Appreciate it.
Thank you. No more citizen comments. Moving on to our next agenda, or our first agenda item for discussion, the Mid-Valley Financial Report.
So Mid-Valley is reporting that their revenues are trending slightly ahead of the prior year due to additional revenue sources, which they have detailed in the memo. Expenditures are trending slightly behind, but overall, there are no areas of concern at this time.
Any discussion on this? Okay, moving on to our next, the D303 May Financial Report. Justin? Go ahead.
The revenue and expenditures, as you can see, are trending very close to the prior year overall. I did want to point out that on the revenue side, you will notice that the tax levy and federal revenue reflect a lower actual to budget trend. And this is due to the timing of tax payments that will be received in June and the timing of some additional federal funds. So that will all level out as we finish the fiscal year. On the expense side, capital outlay is also trending with a lower actual to budget spending trend. And this is also due to timing of some capital purchases that are happening at the end of the year. So the district continues to be on track to finish the year within our budget parameters.
We're still right now showing deficit, right, for the end of the year?
Yes, you're right. Yes,
okay.
Because the percentages are based on the percent of budget. And so it looks like we are trending to end the year very close to where our budget is set.
Okay. Any additional discussion? No. All right. Okay, we're moving on to agenda item C, elementary building usage, Lincoln Elementary, Haines, and Fox Ridge Early Childhood Center.
Mr. Lentz, thank you. Christine and Justin will be going through a brief PowerPoint regarding the conversation that we've been having for many months now. So with that, Christine, do you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. So as we start this evening, our outcome really is to provide a recommendation of a space scenario that meets those criteria that we established the last time, or probably 3 times ago now, really focusing in on space that allows us to implement those strategic priorities that's aligned to our minimum standards, being within our financial parameters, aligning to the facility guiding practices that you all approved, as well as taking into account the accounts for future needs, as well as impact on students and families. So as you've seen us do in the past, this really talks about how does this connect back to our strategic plan. And this really does start with that together building pathways to excellence. This is providing different ways for our students to receive different kinds of services, particularly in the areas of early childhood, transition, and Compass Academy. It also connects strongly with our district core values. All of the minimum standards you might remember are established utilizing the belonging, perseverance, and achievement, which guided us in determining and setting those priorities. In the master plan, one of the questions that came up last time is how can we think about and process through this kind of through phases? And so went back and I really looked at kind of the work that was done through the Master Facility Planning Committee or the CAC committee to kind of guide and put some of these together. And it really came down to, we had like 2 kind of big ideas. We had this idea that there's urgent things that we need to do. And then there were things that were of high importance that we needed to do. And the urgent things that we really needed to focus in on was that addressing that elementary overcrowding, which was causing those space and equity issues, as well as wanting to make sure we address the high need capital projects. And the other piece to that was that we wanted to make sure that we were in a spot to implement this in the 24-25. So the goal was that we were going to reduce that overcrowding for the 24-25 school year. And we kind of broke that urgent down into 2 pieces. One, really kind of what I just laid out, and the second one then into the boundaries, right? In order for us to address those overcrowding, we have to also address boundaries. So that first set is to say, here's where we want, and here's what we wanted to have in our buildings. Next is here's how we think we're going to do that. And then finally in the fall would be moving into taking a look at what are those boundaries so that we can implement each of those minimum standards. That's not to say or forget about the other things that came through and that are of high importance. And that really is about addressing the accessibility issues. We have a couple schools in which that continues to be an issue. It also There were many other needs that were identified in that plan through the Master Facility Committee, as well as for us to take a look at what is our capital projects. What are the things we need to have in place in order to maintain our buildings? So talk a little bit about that secondary enrollment and capacity. So we really leaned into the report from RSP where they did that capacity and enrollment. And when we look at the high school, there are no urgent facility needs at the high school level. Over the next 5 years, we're seeing a decrease in students, as well as when you look at that functional capacity, you can see that North is well right in the range of 85 to 95%, which is where we would like our schools to be. And then if you take a look at East, we're seeing that they're between 74 and 78, which is actually their buildings are a little underutilized. In regards to middle school, there is a projected increase in enrollment of 311 students. That enrollment projection really impacts Redling Middle School rather than Thompson. When we see those students kind of coming in, you'll see that the capacity, the functional capacity puts Thompson right where we want it to be, between 85 and 95%, a little on the high end, but it does put Redling over the top at 113% over time. What's important for us to think about is the increased enrollment is really for a very limited amount of time. So we are anticipating, like, we're calling it kind of a bubble of students, probably for 3 to 4 years where we'll be at that capacity, but it's not something that will be forever an issue or concern. And the reason we really came to that conclusion is when we look at those projections, our elementary enrollment is at its highest next school year. And then then we see a steady decrease over the next 4 years. And then if you take our K-1-2 kids, right, those kids will all go 6, 7, 8. We can see that we're projected to be at about 2,300 and the buildings are projected for a capacity of 2,800. So that tells us that for a limited amount of time, we do have some overcrowding and some issues that we need to make sure that we manage. Because it's a limited amount of time, we don't necessarily see this as a brick or mortar solution that we need to build or add onto our middle schools. We do believe that there are action steps that we need to take. And one of them would be to review our boundaries, specifically because the increase is so inequitable by building. So we want to have RSP look to see, is that something that we could maybe alleviate? The second one really has to do with bringing a middle school committee together and really focusing in on administrators, teachers, support staff, to look at what is going to happen in that enrollment and really start to address what are our scheduling practices, how might that impact hallways, how are we using our classrooms, how are we assigning our classrooms? For instance, every teacher has their very own classroom, which is wonderful, but in this short period of time, we might need to think differently about that. And we might need to think about how can we use all of our classrooms throughout the course of the day and maybe have offices for teachers. So how might that look out? So those are some of the things the committee could do, but we'd ask that committee come together, the people who are closest to the problem, to help us kind of come forward with some solutions on how we could manage that.
So earlier in the month, when we were discussing this at the June 12th board meeting, we talked about a lot of scenarios that we looked at, and we ranked all those scenarios against the following evaluation criteria. So supporting implementation of strategic priorities, whether or not the overall cost was within the district's ability to raise funds, whether or not they align with the facility guiding principles that the board adopted, whether they consider the future needs and growth and provide flexibility to meet future needs, and whether or not the scenario creates minimal disruption to students and families. And the scenarios that we moved forward that we're going to discuss tonight are scenario D and scenario G. So scenario D was relocating the transitions program and L&T offices to Lincoln, relocating early childhood to Haines, and then maintaining Compass at Haines. Scenario G was relocating EC to Haines with transitions remaining here, moving L&T to Lincoln with only ADA updates and minimal other changes, and then reintegrating Compass services into North and East for the 24-25 school year. So as we looked at scenario G, one of the few of the reasons why we did set scenario G aside is that it really does not support the implementation of the strategic priorities that the board has talked about. It also diminishes the learning experience for some of our students. EC would reduce square footage wise overall if it moved into this area of Haines, and Compass Academy services really can't be effectively provided within the comprehensive high schools. It also limits the professional learning space and the board space that we have within the district. So we are maintaining our recommendation of scenario D. As we look at scenario D, we do believe that it provides the minimum space necessary to meet all learning outcomes. It enhances learning environments. It improves the learning experience of transition students by having easy access to areas of downtown St. Charles that they frequent most. It also provides professional learning spaces. It modernizes Lincoln and meets the ADA requirements, and it does provide for flexibility and growth here at Haines to accommodate future needs. So as a reminder, the total cost of scenario D, it was about 6.8 million to move transitions and L&T to Lincoln, just under 8 million to move early childhood here to Haines, for a total of about 14.6 million in total. So our recommendation continues to be scenario D, relocating transitions, L&T and professional learning space to Lincoln, and then relocating early childhood to Haines and maintaining Compass Academy here in its current space.
So board, we just did a very high level overview of the different conversations that we've been having for a number of months. Again, also highlighting the different aspects throughout our board report that will be available to the community tomorrow. So I'll hand it over to the committee chairs and start with any questions.
In our last meeting, we talked about scenario D, and the ask was for the list of assumptions of what we are going to do to Lincoln, right? We're in a tight fiscal spot this year, and getting an understanding of what all is included in that price tag for Lincoln, I think at a much more granular level, I'd like to be able to pull that for the board to be able to make some decisions on it, especially when we start to talk about updating that building and the things that we potentially have to do, right? So if we start converting all those classrooms, start having to pull HVAC, do other things with it, what does that do to the costs, et cetera, and getting a better understanding of that to, again, minimize the cost at this time for the district.
That's included in our board packet for the board. It literally, Wold gave us a detailed list of HVAC, restroom renovations, light renovations, all the way through. They detail each one of those components because we heard that ask. Wold stepped forward and made sure that we had those pieces with a recognition that once, if the board chooses to go this direction, Wold and their team of engineers and others will dig in deeply to Lincoln, to Haines, and all those other aspects, and continue to come back. But that is part of our appendix on page 6 under the overall cost. There's a link there that can be found.
While we take a look at that, I'd like to bring up that, one of the challenges that we face as the board, I think, is that there are certainly more needs than can be met with the dollars that are available, even with the debt scenario that we've been talking about. When we go back to the work that the CAC did with Wold and otherwise to look at the entirety of all of not only the critical needs in terms of what I often refer to as fleet maintenance, but also those concepts that could really enhance student experience and have a positive outcome on academic results. The price tag, if we go back to those conversations, when we looked at the first 3 scenarios with price tags attached to them, they were in the hundreds of millions. One of the challenges, I think, and I think one of the wisdoms in looking closely at the Lincoln issue is we face the necessity to solve one of the problems as quickly as possible with the overcrowding in the elementary schools. I think it's incumbent upon us to think about the ways that positions us for some of those future expenditures that we might want to make. I recognize that we don't yet have a referendum. We don't have the money to make those, and it might be the wrong time to even have that discussion. At the same time, when we make decisions around scenario D or any other, it's its position within the context of broader aims for the district over a 10-year period, I think is really relevant. I think there's a real concern about the potential for almost stranded costs in a move like this that says if there's a second or third move that we need to make facilities wise to get to a better outcome in the future, how much of the money that we invest in, say, particularly Lincoln, but also in Haines, is money that gets stranded in a short-term fix. And I think you've done a good job explaining the middle school short-term fix and the potential for boundaries to do that. I guess one of the concerns, and sorry for the long intro to it, one of the concerns is how do we think about this scenario D as both a springboard to what we'd like to do in the future or a first step toward versus, this is the wrong characterization, but I can't think of a better one, a blind alley that leads to some stranded costs both in Lincoln and in Haines.
So thank you for that question. I do see this as a true springboard for long-term facility success being that we do not continue to engage overcrowding, especially at the elementary level. So if I were to think, into the future, if we did it, so if we put this scenario D into play, if the board says yes to this scenario, we also are thinking down the road, 2-3 years down the road, if the board chose to do a referendum. I see this as a true down payment on that referendum because the moves that we would make here would layer into that referendum. So let me talk about from the EC here at Haines. This is one of those sites that can be expanded. That was an ask by Mrs. Feargrieve. What are we at the right size for our EC program? Is there a place to potentially expand? Currently, we have it programmed for what we currently have, but this is a site that allows us to grow if the board chooses to move to, currently we're roughly around 310, give or take. But could we move that to a 400 number? Yes, at Haines, we absolutely could because we do have space out here for future expansion. So when we think about the Lincoln site being used, that is going to be used for our transition students, which really does have a nice unique aspect for it, be connected to the library, probably the number one facility that they use where our students are engaged at the library, specifically at the Bean, the coffee shop there, supporting that. But again, transition program, its main intent is really trying to get our students out into that workforce and really engaging within our community. That gives them greater access to downtown accessibility. But also what Lincoln does for us is create space for district office personnel, which is needed. That's an area that I believe needs to be taken care of. I think the other piece it does is a professional learning center that allows us to have those pieces in play. A district our size, we need to be having professional learning on our campuses somewhere where we're not, as we currently do, have to ask schools to move classrooms so staff can come in and do continuous learning. So we have those two places. I see both of those pieces being long-term solutions, no matter what, if we chose to go down that road, those are moves that we would not undo. We have been very thoughtful about ensuring that we would not go back and redo cost or move a program out. This will be the right place for EC if the board chooses later on to continue Compass here in that site. That's a good pairing. And then when we think about Fox Ridge is needed. It is needed as a elementary school. We need to open that back up as an elementary school. It served its purpose as a EC center, but it needs to go back there. So when you're thinking about the moves long-term from a referendum, there are other pieces that need to occur, but we need our 11 elementary schools. The piece within that report from RSP, as we look out 27, 28, our elementary numbers do go down by 50 students. 50 overall students, we dropped down. So we're not seeing this huge decline in elementary students. It's not like the middle school issue where we do see this group of students moving through in long term. And with the middle school, it's even a longer term because we get to see that birth rate, those hot spots. So we know with pretty great clarity that that's going to be a good solution there. But we also have with great clarity that our elementaries are going to be consistent with where we're at right now. So we know we need those 11 schools in our district. With that, as I see it as a down payment to be able to do the work that we're doing at those 3 sites, I don't believe that a referendum coming in again 2, 3, 5 years later, whatever it is, we would look back and say those were bad. These are bad decisions. These are good long-term solutions that allow the district to move forward in a future-focused manner. Long-winded way to your long-winded opening.
Aren't we a pair? Aren't we a pair? Maybe a rebuttal then. I'll try to be a little more concise. There is a real cost to the community on this step, and we see that in the dollars. There's a second real impact that I think we have to talk about, which is the change in boundaries that it creates. And this move sets us up to make a responsible set of decisions around the boundary changes. At the same time, there are other elementary school challenges that we face. We have some facilities challenges at Wild Rose, Wasco, and Davis, especially, that come to mind. And we have some teaching and kind of teaching philosophy methodology challenges with Richmond Davis and the primary intermediate split that will come closely. I guess I would, recognizing that we're already imposing on the community a dollar cost, but also a disruption cost, I think it would behoove us to think hard about what those additional elementary steps could look like in the near term, particularly as they affect boundaries. The closest in on that, from my point of view, is Richmond Davis. Now, today, that's boundaried in a unit basis, meaning Richmond and Davis kids go to Richmond and Davis. First one, then the other. And so if we make decisions that change that, it has the potential to disrupt boundaries. Again, if we make further changes to a school like Davis that increases its capacity. So I just want us to be cognizant of the fact that those are coming decisions that this step sets up.
Yes, so thank you for that. You're absolutely right. The boundaries will touch 100% of our elementary schools and families. Let me pull that back. 100% of our schools will be touched by those boundaries. Not 100% of our families will be touched by those boundaries, but every school will have some movement of their boundaries. As we look across the field, how do we create greater equity within each of our schools? So that is a consistent piece that we have to apply, and we'll move from one end of the district to the other end of the district. The Davis-Richmond is a question that RSP will be coming to the board in September as they begin the boundary process. One of those pieces will be under the guiding principles that the board will set to say, is this a district that believes just in K-5s, or is this a district that does believe in a primary center, in an intermediate center? That is a critical step that the board needs to address fairly early in the process, because as Mr. Lackner said, that changes boundaries differently, because we currently viewed as one school from a boundary idea. This would say there's 2 schools. Some boundaries would need to look differently. So that piece would need to be in consideration. One of the other ideas that people have brought forward is, what about Davis? Do the work at Davis, like total work going in at Davis, and make Davis a larger elementary school, and then potentially putting Richmond as an EC center. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, 2 years ago, the district in Wold actually looked at that piece. So Justin, can you talk to us about those numbers? Dan, please jump in wherever you need to.
Yeah, we didn't look at the Richmond piece of converting that to an EC center, but we did look at the beginning of last year at converting Davis and essentially allowing it to house all of the students that attend the Richmond and Davis campus. So about 700 students total. that included demolition of that two-story wing that has all the ADA issues and adding another addition to house all of the students. Part of the issue that we have on that site is that all of the land out there we don't own. Park District owns a good chunk of that green space that's attached to the Davis site. And the total for last year, the total of construction was about 53 million to convert that Davis site to house everyone, including all the ADA upgrades that would be necessary.
So as we've looked at that piece, it was one of those ideas where like, we don't feel like this is a viable solution. One, from the standpoint, I don't believe in a 700 student elementary school, just from a sheer numbers. That would look so different than every other elementary in this district and in neighboring districts around here. That is more of a Arizona, California model that we just didn't think was viable, nor did we think the $50 million price tag and whatever escalations over the next few years, 3, 4, 5% on top of that, I would assume. So that was why we thought about, because people have asked us that question, and we really wanted to make sure, would that work in a referendum? Should we just hold and wait for a referendum? But that was another reason why we're like, no, RD really does play into a long-term strategy that continues to allow our district to have equity of space at our elementaries, our middle schools. Again, as Christine kind of walked through there, our middle schools work with boundaries, with bringing middle school people together to really think about how can we do our hallway transition, because our middle schools, when you really talk and hear from our middle school teachers and principals, we have hallway issues, especially at Red Lane. There's a couple just bottlenecks that there's a lot of kids coming out at the same time. We have different schedules that we believe could be really impactful for that. The high schools, as you saw, and again, this is on student enrollment. We recognize there are some issues at our high schools that need to be addressed in different ways, but not in a student capacity, building facility capacity.
It would be important to me as a board member to make sure, to Joe's point, that we are looking long-term. I don't want to be focused merely on Lincoln, Fox Ridge, EC, Haines, because I know we're going to have these other discussions. So I'm glad to hear that you're saying we're going to be talking about this in September, so that when we are considering boundary, that we are looking at the whole picture. That's really important, because I don't want to just onesie twosie, because it looks to me like that is possibly the way it was approached in the past. I don't know, I wasn't here, but I'm saying that as a community member at that time, it looked very hyper focused on certain things, and looking at it in the broad sense is what's really more helpful for me. One thing, I did a little bit of research on ALOP today, and I learned that ALOP funding is available through all the way back to grade 4. Therefore, if grades 4 and 5, to my understanding, grades 4 and 5 need to remain at their home school, but grades 6 through 12 can be housed elsewhere. And one of the really great things about what I learned today was that it's kind of similar to the way health insurance is priced out, the way the ALOP funding is awarded to each district. We as a district have less ALOP students per percentage of our population. However, our funding amount gets wrapped in with the county. And so because neighboring communities, neighboring schools in King County have more ALOP percentage students, we get to, I don't know, I'm going to say this perfectly because I just learned all this today, but we get a higher percentage because we're allotted more because of the group that we are compiled with. And so that was really exciting to me to know. And the more students we have at Compass, the higher the percentage of our funding gets. So it becomes less of a a strain when it's more focused with ALOP. So I think it's a big win-win to hear that if we do choose scenario D and we keep Haines here, knowing that we have an overpopulation problem for, I think you said 3 to 4 years coming, is that 27, 28 school year? Something like that?
27, 28 is when it becomes.
Begins.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah, is at its worst.
As it worst. Okay. So leading up to that point, we can have that discussion, hopefully, when we're talking about boundaries and what does this whole picture look like, we can possibly consider as a board. I would like to consider as a board through business services initially, if we can look to expand housing of middle school students here, because that would ease the pressure, and keeping it through ALOP, we're managing that funding as opposed to adding another financial drain. It becomes covered through the ISBE.
A couple thoughts on that. I appreciate that you just learned some of this today. I guess I would disagree. I don't think that what you're really talking about, I understand some of the benefits and the outcomes that you're articulating, but what I'm hearing you talk about are really program changes in terms of we would be expanding Compass beyond high school, as we talked about last night. So in my mind's eye, if we wanted to entertain that, that would need to go back to learning and teaching at some point in time. And I would make the comment related to Compass and our discussion about Richmond and Davis as well. I think it's very important to me as a board member, as a board, that we are thinking intentionally about the programming and the strategies related to education that we want to do and we think are right for our district, and then think about the funding. Not that it's an afterthought, but I get worried. I don't want the funding to wag the dog to drive the education.
I totally agree. When I was learning this, I was thinking of it as a positive when we're trying to we should always be hyper conscious of funding. But I was thinking about not to put the cart before the horse. So I'm glad the way you said that. That's not my intention. My intention is saying I'm hoping that we can think about that as we're going through this process. I misspoke when I said send it to business services. It should go to learning and teaching. But for me, I was thinking that it would be important to have these discussions so we're not, to your point, changing things later that we could have put in place during this time.
Well, the challenge on funding availability after a decision has been made about the program's efficacy for the students here and exhausting all of the available funds is a reasonable one to have. I think that there's an important point about where are the parameters of that program and how those get decided first, and then offering the charge to the administration to go exhaust every single grant and other alternative funding program that exists to pull those funds in D303's, warranted share of those funds. So I think there's at least 2 points there, but this idea of having a discussion of which programs will deliver on the goals that the board has set and then funding those feels like a good process.
The other thing I would add around the Richmond Davis, I do think it's an interesting question. And because I don't think we've really talked about, and with this board and previous boards I've been on, we have not really talked about, do we agree? Why is Richmond Davis kind of unique out there? And does that still fit with the educational strategies for this district, or we've never really talked about that.
From the lens of the primary center.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. The board has to have that conversation, and we will make sure that occurs in September because that will be a major impact on the boundaries. Absolutely.
And I do think that should be factored in.
Oh,
So
that
whatever
piece,
we do.
that piece has to be factored in. Yes, we will make sure that is teed up for the board.
So I think kind of the way we talked about this before is we should prioritize programs, look at our facilities, and then look at funding. And it sounds like what we're starting to say here a little bit is that we should start to look at programming in order to facilitate funding. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to say we need to increase our ALOP kids so we can get more dollars in.
If I could on that, Mr. McNally, I think it's an important point and one that I don't want to sidetrack the conversation. But the one nice piece about the Haines Center is it's one of the only places that can be expanded. So at any other time, we can talk about that if that's of the board's prerogative, if they want to grow either of these two programs here, that's the board prerogative. But
I just want to, I'm sorry, I spoke too loudly there. Wow. I just want to make sure that we are kind of following that. It's the same procedure we kind of set out with at the beginning. And that is, what programming do we need first? What facilities do we have? And if we need to change, alter, or expand facilities, how can we come up with the dollars to do that? I don't want to put the dollars first. We do have to consider the dollars, and then we have to prioritize that programming.
Just a couple other comments as we're talking about the ALOP. I think it's important just to remember, I think we all know here, but that is an opt-in program by the parents and the families. So that's not any type of guarantee as far as, you know, or an outlet for facility. And then second of all, from my standpoint, philosophically, ALOP as it's defined, those numbers should be going down over time. And if they are going down, then we're doing a lot of good things and our students are progressing forward in the right direction.
On that note as well, we have to apply, is it every 5 years?
That's for the competency waiver. For ALOP, we need to apply every year.
Right.
And to add middle school would be, we'd have to go back to the initial application process, because that would be, that's not what our current application is. So we have like what's called a continuing application, because we put in for our high school services. So we'd have to go back and kind of start at that point.
And so those are not guaranteed funds is kind of my.
Well, we have to, the funds are guaranteed as long as the program is approved.
Right.
So first the program would need to be approved. While there's absolutely benefit to thinking like that, I would say we would need to do a deep dive into what services and supports are appropriate for our students in middle school. What does the research tell us about students in middle school who are at risk for academic failure? It might be a separate school. That could very well be, but I can't say that confidently. And so I guess what I'm saying is, while we can certainly look at that, I don't think that's something we can put together a well thought out program supported by evidence. Like we need a couple of years to do that. That's what I'm trying to say.
My point really is that the funding is not anything that we can control our own budget much more readily than we can control what we're going to get from outside funds. Because again, some of that stuff it's dictated by people outside this organization. We can't control those funds, and we can't be as certain of those funds as we can within our own budget. So I think we have to start with the proper priorities.
I would like to go back to the conversation that Mr. Lackner put out and just kind of ask you a couple questions. Do you see a scenario that you haven't verbalized at this point in time that warrants us to wait another year or two before we begin this process?
I haven't seen any that would cause me to think that this step is really a challenge. I have some reservations about the size of the investment at Lincoln, and but they are marginal dollars. So if I look at the total of the investment, it's on the margin where we have some challenges there. I just was looking at some of those numbers. And so I have some pause there, but overall, I don't feel that this step precludes us from moving forward to the things that have been contemplated previously. I just, to bring us back to this point, that's scenario D, one of the programs on which we all agree, or we probably wouldn't be sitting here, is that we all need excellent elementary schools. And so this is part of that answer. And so I look at it that way and see it as a step. I challenged both Mr. Attaway and Dr. Gordon pretty directly around whether or not this would inhibit our ability to move cost effectively toward other moves. And their answer was no, they didn't feel that it would. In fact, it would jumpstart us. And so I trust that analysis at present and feel like we're in pretty safe space, recognizing that there will be some marginal costs in the Lincoln step that could end up stranded.
Thank you, because I think the question was a good one. I just wanted to be sure that it wasn't just a question and you had other answers. So I appreciate that. And just to, the boundary stuff is going to be big. And the philosophies and the programs and looking at all of that. Our work is not done. And we're got to roll up our sleeves and really do a lot. And I just want to say publicly, this document that was put together, both the strategic plan and the facilities, is outstanding. I could easily click to see what I needed to see. And I hope that the public will find it very useful as well. It's a history. It's well detailed. It's answered a lot of our questions because we've been talking about this. I think, Thomas, since you've been on CAC, we've been talking about this.
For sure.
And so I really appreciate the work that was put into that because that is time consuming. And I think this should be our guidance to what we do. And I wanted to thank you all for that work.
Thank you for that.
Two questions that I've got. Paul, when we mentioned the Davis update,
Yes.
the 700 was within the current boundaries, right? So that's what we looked at it, current boundaries, everybody who's in there fitting in that building, right?
Correct.
Okay. So we, in theory, potentially it could be what we're expecting for what we've set as our elementary standards then. Does that move the needle?
It would change the design because we would expect that those same standards are met there. It just double everything over there. When we look across the board, the number one piece is we need each elementary school to house a significant number of students. And that's where the Lincoln piece really comes into, with only 12 classrooms. And there is only limited land to grow there. There just is. Schools need so much acreage to really build. And people talk about, you can build up. Can only build up so much, and especially in an older facility, it's just very different. But when we think about that piece and taking Lincoln off, and then we are implementing Fox Ridge, if we were to make a change that I talked to, an idea that I put out there was that Davis becomes almost a super sized elementary school, and then the Richmond becomes the EC. I just don't see us having one school at 700 students. And again, that's going to be give or take based off of the boundaries where, it could be 650, whatever it is. But I still need all those elementary schools to be able to house our students, because as we look back at the RSP, we're only going down 50 overall students. So we don't have this significant decline in elementary students. So our facilities are needed, and they're all going to still be in that 85 to 95. That's where we want them, that capacity rate, which is a lot better than where we're currently at like a Fearson Creek, a Belgraham, a Munhall, all of those sites. Does that answer it?
It does.
Okay. On that note, I just want to, kind of point out that as you were talking about making that super elementary school, really what we would be doing then is going from one inequity, a K through 2, 3 through 5, that was unlike the rest of the district, to a different inequity.
Right.
And I don't want to do that either. So I think we need to be, that's why I'm happy, happy to take the time. One of the problems that we've had in the time that I've been on this board and preceding that time is often we have made decisions too quickly. And if it takes a little more time to make the decisions, so be it. And even if it means we have to look and maybe try to find those scenarios where there's going to be a problem. I think that's where we have in the past failed, is we haven't looked to see beyond what that next step is.
Or holistically, right? We know we also have some significant maintenance costs coming down the pipe here, and layering that in, especially when we're starting to talk about funding here as well. I think we need to be really cognizant of that.
That piece will be coming to July business services meeting. We'll make sure the board sees that ahead of time. Wool's been a great partners of ours, really putting together our 10-year capital project plan. But it's significant dollars, again, dollars that don't need to be spent all in year one. It's a 10-year plan. But as you indicated, Thomas, there are other needs in our organization outside of the ones that Mr. Lackner spoke about on just an ADA facility from the Wild Rose ADA compliance issues.
The second question I had, so actually digging into the Lincoln, right? I share the same concern that Mr. Lackner does. The ask that I have, I saw we put in there heavy renovation, light renovation, everything else. The part for me, again, and I'll bring back to my comments from the last meeting on this topic, was when we're moving L&T over, right? Not our little folks, not our learners, but when we're moving our district staff over, managing that renovation, right? And again, I appreciate
I
the
hear that.
team, right? But I want to make sure that we are conscious with the budget on that. And so again, if we're tearing down walls in those classrooms and completely redoing them to turn them into offices versus throwing cubes in there, painting it, that's kind of where I was hoping to get kind of that level of like, okay, what's the heavy renovation? Is that, putting in the kitchen, putting in the other stuff that we need for transitions? Is it just that level?
And that's that piece that will come.
Okay.
So if the board says, yes, you do this, this is where I'm going to have Dan speak to this. That's that next level of work that Mr. Lackner is saying is bring that back to us. And what you've been saying, let us see that detail behind it. What is that? So Dan, do you want to kind of talk about what that next process is? If the board says, yes, go forward, then what does Wold do?
Well, so the costs that we apply, the metrics we apply right now are just trying to get a gauge on what are the interventions for different levels, whether it's a heavy renovation, moderate renovation, or light renovation. And then we put together what we see as today's metric to apply to that square footage. That's the high level that the lens we took as we put these costs together. The next step, if the board sees this as a direction they want to move forward on, is we get in and do some more field reconnaissance, understand the building issues, some of the givens, as well as talk to the users that are going to be in those spaces, the stakeholders that are going to be in those spaces, so we can get a better understanding of what are their space needs, what do they need immediately, what could be something that could be phased in. So when you see that the renovation for Lincoln, moving L&T over there, part of that is there's some assumptions built in that we are going to preserve walls, but also build out some private office areas and let them function in the manner that we see them best operating in. It doesn't mean that that's going to be the end all solution. There might be some peel back that we could look at of is this more of a moderate renovation because we're not touching as many things as we thought we were. So from a high level, there are assumptions built in that, but I think they're pretty educated assumptions that this is the kind of work we would see doing to create office space out of classrooms without knocking down major walls and bearing walls. We're trying to live within a lot of the givens, but we are turning it in from an educational environment to an office environment. And that does affect some of your power requirements, some of your HVAC requirements. So that tips you into that moderate to heavy renovation number. Does that help?
It does. And that's where I was coming at it from, the concern of saying, what do we actually need from an office space for the folks that are moving over there, right? Do we need to completely gut those rooms and do HVAC and everything else, or can they live with the cubicles, right? Especially with the position that we're in fiscally right now. That's all. So if that's the next phase of this, so where we can get kind of the details of that, I'd welcome that discussion.
Which then as follow-up to that would mean that as a board, we could lower the cost.
Yeah, at that point, that's when we keep coming back to you, say this is what it would look like. This is that peel back a little bit. One thing that I always make sure that we caution and we're future focused, because that's been quite honestly the conversation tonight, is that we don't do something light and then recognizing today's dollars and not using today's dollars and then coming back in 5-10 years and doing something that we wish we would have done with tomorrow's dollars. Tomorrow's dollars are always more expensive. So I always want us, while recognizing the dollars today really do matter and it does impact our community, I also want to make sure that we're doing right for the future. And then the board, I'm not coming back to the board in 5 years and saying, I need an additional now $10 million to do this space all the way to the end degree. So I want to balance those two, because
it's a point well taken, right? Especially because the second half of the ask is dealing with decisions that weren't made previously, right? So we're talking about updating the other wing, putting in fire suppression, putting in everything else. So it's a point
Yeah.
well taken.
Yeah, but your points are a really important one that we know that we keep, this is not the end of the conversation. If the board chooses to move forward with this, that conversation continues and you do get into some of the nitty gritty detail. So the board knows what we're going out for.
I think there's this saying that I've heard in other places, under budget and on time. And I think that you're hearing loud and clear where this board is going to be. And I do not see us having a referendum for quite some time. So I think, to the point, whatever we can do to help keep costs down, and hearing from you first would be fabulous, rather than us spending hours telling you what we think.
That will occur.
We will tell you what we think.
Yes, we don't have to worry about that.
I have a quick question, somewhat related to what Mr. Lentz was saying. It made me think a little bit more regarding the movement of transition to Lincoln, right? And more of an itemized cost of what that will be, because if memory serves me correctly, we had relatively recently upgraded the space here for transition, right? The 12,000 square foot facility
I think that was
here.
in 2019.
2019, so about 4 years ago or so. And so I was just curious, because I recognize that I've never asked this, and I'm sorry that I didn't ask it in advance, but what did that cost us? What were the specifications necessary? And would similar spends be needed at Lincoln? Would it be more challenging because it's a 95-year-old building? And, given that we just made these changes approximately 4 years ago, it made me think, okay, what costs are we going to incur that would be similar to costs that we just spent about 4 years ago?
Yeah, we went back to that bid from 2019 to try to extract those costs. And the problem is the cost for the transitions renovation were buried in all of the costs. So everything was in a base bid, and nothing was broken out. And so
I couldn't find it. So that's
Yeah.
comforting to me, because I thought it might be me.
No, so we've got the base bid for all of Haines, but we were not able to break out the individual spaces and what the allocation was for there.
And wasn't there an IDEA construction grant also that paid for quite a bit of it?
So, yeah, the IDA construction grant paid for about $100,000 of the renovation, and then an additional $50,000 in furniture and fixtures.
So those two classrooms, what we were able to, as Justin talked about, really digging into all these different documents, not roughly, it was $163,508, roughly. It might have been a few cents somewhere. But as Justin said, there was an IDA grant, roughly 100,000 for construction itself, and 52,000 was awarded for furniture. That was just from stoves, kind of that apartment idea. And many of those, if we felt the need, would be able to be moved over to the other place. So in those two rooms only, as Justin said, big numbers overall, but because those were specifically around transition, we were able to pull those two classroom numbers out at 163.
Those two classrooms were included as an alternate in the
Yes.
bid. So the bulk of transitions was in the base bid, and then those two classrooms in particular were included as an alternate, which is why we were able to determine individual costs on that.
So can we walk through on that note, why we've talked about scaling back early childhood so that it really would only be at existing numbers with, I believe, one additional classroom for additional, if we get additional students that need assistance. Even with that scale back, transitions does not work to stay where it is in Haines. Can we talk through that scenario?
So there's 10 classrooms in the E wing that those would all be converted over to EC classrooms with some intermediate space for support within that area. We also have to create some restrooms for that younger age group. All the office area and the additional 4 classrooms start to trip over into the transition side, and using that music wing across from the gym is important. There's also a large motor skills that was slated to likely go into that one of those large music classrooms. So from trying to separate the early childhood functions and not bridging over in the transition area was difficult to leave everything where it was, because they're actually using a space across the hall from where the two classrooms are built. They're actually using one of the music suite classrooms at this time. So there, a little bit of it is just the overlap of EC and transitions not really having a clean break. That was the thought process, that transitions would, to have a contiguous EC program, that space would be best used for additional classrooms to get to that 14 plus support space, some kind of a learning center, because they don't really have a learning resource center like they do at Fox Ridge now. That the library basically serves that, but they don't use it in its entirety. So, and again, some of these are kind of conceptual 10,000 foot assessments here, but it looked like that area from a support area had offices and restrooms and things that would cater to the EC program really well. And just from a square footage standpoint, we gauge that Fox Ridge is using about 42,000 square feet of that school currently. Probably a little less efficient just because they're kind of moved in as is. Here, we think that that same program would fit in closer to a 37 to 39,000 square feet and just be more efficient. So we need that space to get to that square foot metric, just to have comparable space to what they have now.
And if I heard you correctly, the 37 to 39,000, that does get us enhancements for the EC.
As far as upgrades to the
Facility
spaces.
enhancements, yeah.
So yes.
Yes.
Yeah. That would outfit all these classrooms to have a level and finishes, painting. So it would be comparable, more modernized than what they have at Fox Ridge. It'd be new.
So let me expand though. So like I heard the learning resource center, we would actually have that here, whereas at Fox Ridge, they've fashioned that like in the library.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It'd probably be a little smaller footprint, but the area by the transition was the area that we thought that might make the most sense to create that kind of a space.
Okay, would we have the same size of like the movement rooms and that type of thing, or would those be enhanced or status quo?
Well, I can speak to the large motor skills space. I think they use the cafeteria, the community room over at Fox Ridge. We were looking at the large, I guess it'd be the old band room or choir room here that had some higher volume and a bigger footprint from a space standpoint. And as we walked through that space, it seemed like it was a good fit.
Okay, thanks.
From transitions, what was the square footage on transitions again, that whole area that they needed? Because one of the things I think I remember hearing is that we at most have 6 of those students in the building at a time, like at max in a classroom.
In a classroom.
In a classroom.
Right. So the numbers are smaller because the way the program is set up is that kids are in and out.
Right.
And in the community quite a bit. I don't know the square footage.
It was originally around 12,000 square feet. We found they do use one of the rooms across the hall at the music suite. So it's around 14,000, 13,500 to 14,000 is what they're using right now.
And then what would they have at Lincoln?
Pretty comparable space with the LRC, the front office area, and at least one band of classrooms on that first level.
I just want to add to that it also enhances the students' learning experiences, particularly because they'll be across the street from the library. We run the Daily Bean in there, and that allows kids to walk back and forth. It also reduces a lot of transportation needs that we currently have, which is to transition kids back and forth through transportation back and forth. I just say that because ultimately it's a better learning environment for students. For our transition students, the location really does provide lots of opportunity for those students.
Thank you for saying that. That's a really key factor for me. So thank you for that additional information, Christine, about transitions and Daily Bean. That makes a lot of sense. And that's a nice box to actually be able to check something that eases transportation for a change.
And I think it is a good point, and it's a point you guys have made quite a bit with the access to the library and the downtown and those professional opportunities. I guess the spirit of my question was, are we spending dollars that we've already spent recently to upgrade the facility to meet those student needs? And then in turn, going and spending similar dollars or identical dollars to upgrade that other space. So, but I definitely appreciate what you say about that experience and the transportation challenges, which we all know are a challenge within the district. I just never like buying things twice, as a business owner myself.
Any further discussion on this item?
Well, if everyone feels comfortable with the content of the conversation, then I would recommend that we move that to the next board meeting for action. Oh, we have one more question.
So we talked about Richmond and Davis and whatever our future educating strategy might be around that. Depending on how that goes, are there implications from a renovation facility standpoint?
You will still have the ADA concern at Davis. You will still have that no matter what we currently have it. We will still have that piece, but
it
no
would not have
others.
to be it would not have to be
No,
addressed.
correct.
Right.
Correct. It would function differently as a K. If the board chose to say it's a K5, they're both K5s. They would just function differently, but it's currently working with, big quotations around it because of the area at Davis where it is just upstairs. So if we do have mobility issues, we'll address those pieces as they've been addressing them currently. So no additional needs would need to make it into a K5 because it used to be a K5.
Okay, so not even restroom facilities or anything.
No, there was no change.
Turnkey,
No,
basically.
that one is a turnkey.
Okay.
With a huge caveat, the ADA pieces are still there. Yeah, but it is a turnkey.
Okay, thank you.
So then I just suggest we bring this to the board for consideration and action at the next discussion, the next board meeting.
No.
July.
In the
That's a
July
valid
meeting.
question.
Mrs. McCabe.
All right. Moving on to our next agenda item for secondary space standards.
My apology, when originally made the agenda, we put them into two, but we did address the secondary space standards in the other one. So we're done with D.
Love that. All right. Moving on to our construction manager recommendation.
So we spoke with the board a little bit last month about finding a qualified construction manager for this upcoming construction that we would have next summer, and then any construction that we have going forward, just to come in and manage that process. We did bring in 4 firms to interview. And of those 4, we do have a recommendation. Pepper Construction is our recommendation of the 4 firms that we interviewed. They were very, very impressive in the interview. The team that they brought was absolutely their A team that they're planning to assign to District 303. Their fees were the most competitive of all the construction managers that we talked to, and their process was very detailed. They talked a lot about pre-construction, about going through cost containment, doing an assessment of all of the designs, making sure that they fit within the budget. If they don't fit within the budget, they talked about sitting down with Wold and making sure that the appropriate adjustments were made to the plans to make sure that we were able to get everything that we needed. They also talked about doing a quality control check to make sure that all of the documents were constructible and that there were no omissions. Not that I'm saying that Wold would have any omissions in the blueprints, but the bonus to that is that once the blueprints hit the street, that there is confidence from the contractors that what they have is good, and therefore we are likely going to get better numbers because contractors don't feel like they need to add any type of inflation into that for unforeseen conditions. The superintendent that they brought with was very, very impressive. That would be on site, on the job every day. We did have Amanda Stuber, who is our new executive director of facilities, sitting there with us because that is going to be her primary point of contact throughout this. She was very comfortable with that. We did have a couple follow-up questions for Pepper today, just to make sure that we were perfectly understanding everything that was going on. So Amanda and I did call Pepper, asked our follow-up questions, and then we had a conversation afterwards and both felt extremely comfortable moving forward with Pepper as the recommendation for tonight.
Awesome.
I think this is a great move. I think we've been around the block a couple times, and I think this is a wise move on our part. Thank you.
Okay. So do we bring this to the full board in the next meeting?
So assuming that there's no discussion here tonight and no objections between tonight and the July board meeting, we'll move forward and negotiate a contract with Pepper and attempt to finish it before the next board meeting so we can bring it for board approval at that time.
Okay. All right. Very good. Moving on to our next agenda item, the reciprocal reporting agreement.
This is just a renewal of an existing agreement that was in place with the Kane County Sheriff. This has been in place for a few years now. This agreement expires on June 30th, so tomorrow. I believe tomorrow. This just extends the reciprocal reporting agreement with the Kane County Sheriff for an additional 2 years.
And there was no modifications to it from the previous agreement.
None that I could see.
Okay. Any discussion on this one? Okay. Moving forward. Our next item, Power School Naviance renewal.
So this is a renewal of a program that the district currently used to track student course credits and completion of graduation requirements. So we are just recommending the renewal of that program for next year.
How just for knowledge, how is this different from the other programs that we have, like Schoology and stuff? What does this do in addition to that?
Yeah, so Naviance is actually really about helping our students as they apply for college. It allows them to put in things like, here's what I'd like to see in a college, and it comes back and it'll say, here are 5 or 6 ones that match what you're looking for. It allows them to track all the work that they're doing. It allows them to complete the common application, which is what they need to do to apply to college once, and then they can send it to multiple places. Teachers can easily complete their letters of recommendation, house them in there, and then those can be sent. So it's really more about the connections that it has and the way in which it supports our students in finding the college that best meets their needs, and then allows them to quickly and easily apply, and allows teachers to quickly and easily meet those requests, because as you can imagine, teachers get numerous requests for letters and that's all in one place. So it really is about helping kids through the college process.
Got it.
As a parent who just had a graduating senior, I found Naviance to be very helpful. It's a nice tool that students use, that the school uses, that parents can see, that was really helpful with the application process. So I really appreciated it as a parent.
Okay. Any further discussion on this one? Bring it to full board. Okay. Next one, assessment platform renewals.
So there are 2 renewals up right now, the Power School Performance Matters and Schoology AMP for local assessments and data platforms. We are recommending that the board approve these renewals again for next year.
And just on the Schoology one, what is that? This aspect of it, is it the?
Sure. So in this is really our what we call a learning management system, and that allows us to house everything and put everything into one place. And then the assessment piece allows us to put the assessments right into that. Students take it right into their Schoology course, and then allows us to easily connect it back to standards, and it allows us to kind of monitor progress standard by standard.
Is this next year, right? We've been adopting Schoology. This next year is full adoption, correct?
So yes, middle and high school are already there and
Elementary
elementary
is next year.
next year moves into that. So it puts all of our reporting into one place, communication for parents. Allows our teachers to collaborate.
I'd assume there's a price change associated with that as well, or how's the year over year pricing structure?
Elementary has always had access, so it's just that we are now, and some teachers, like, we've kind of given them opportunity, but next year, all elementary teachers need to use that, and we are shutting down all the other ways in which they might be, like Google Classroom and Seesaw would be the two.
So it's essentially the same platform, but we'd just be utilizing it
Putting
more
everything in,
effectively?
yes.
Okay, thank you.
And it looks like this renewal does include 12,000 students.
Everybody. Okay. And so Seesaw and Google Classrooms are going to be gone from budget for after next year.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay. Any further discussion? Bring it to full board. Okay. And our final agenda item, student software delivery system renewal.
So we use the Citrix platform to deliver software to both students and staff on site and remotely. This includes applications needed for PLTW along with a few others. This system does include licensing for 300 secondary students to use these applications from home on any device right now. So this again is a renewal for 1 year of use on this platform again for next school year.
Any discussion? No. Bring it to full board. Okay, moving into our agenda, into our adjournment phase here. Any future agenda items? I think we got a busy couple.
July is going to be draft 2 of the FY24 budget. So we'll be bringing that back, which then will likely become the tentative budget for fiscal year 24. Also, we'll be continuing all the conversations around construction for next summer. And we'll specifically be getting into the funding portion of that discussion.
Okay. That takes us to adjournment. Thank you, everybody. What is that? What's up? Yeah. 6:49.
I would like to call to order this special meeting of the school board on Thursday, June 29th, 2023 at 7:02 PM. Ms. Marsan, would you please take the roll?
Yes, Mrs. Bell,
Here.
Mr. Kuschert,
Here.
Mr. Lackner,
Here.
Mr. Lentz,
Here.
Mrs. McCabe,
Here.
Mr. McNally,
Here.
and Mrs. Fairgrave.
Here, please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And we do not have any citizen comments at this time, so we'll move to section 3 of the agenda, which is for action. First item relates to Compass Academy. Do I have a motion to approve Compass Academy as an alternative learning opportunity program, also known as ALOP, and continue housing it at a location outside of the comprehensive high school setting?
So moved.
Thank you, Mrs. Bell. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. McCabe. Any discussion at this time?
I have just a quick little thought that I had, and I'd love to get a little feedback here from the board, especially with the way that it's presented with the recommended action. You know, we've obviously done a really deep dive in Compass. I personally have learned so much about it. It's really been a good experience to understand it because I was admittedly ignorant to a lot of the offerings and what we do with Compass. And it's a pretty appears to be a really strong program for these ALOP students. So I support the program and certainly the student body. One of my challenges remains where it needs to be housed, right? And I don't know if we know exactly that answer yet. And so it kind of feels like in survey development, they call it like a double-barreled question, right? They're asking you if you like this and do you agree with this? And so there's two variables here that we're considering. Motion to approve Compass as an ALOP program and then continue housing it outside of that location. And so I'm firm on one and I'm a little confused on the other. And so it makes it a little bit challenging for me to confidently vote yes, when I still have a few questions about where it would necessarily be housed. And I suppose where part of that confusion lies is as I learn more and more about Compass, which again is an impressive program, and I look at our peer and our aspirational districts and where they're housing these ALOP students and where they're serving these ALOP students. And, a lot of what we've talked about is just excluding the high schools as a landing spot for Compass. But it appears any number of other locations are a potential landing spot for that. So I just wanted to share my confusion with the board as we go to put this to vote. I've voiced this already to a couple of other folks, but I don't know if I've ever voiced it publicly. So I just wanted to put that out there and see if there were any thoughts along those lines.
I don't think there's any other thoughts. So thank you for those comments. Ms. Marsan, would you please take the roll call for vote?
Yes, Mr. Kuschert,
Yes.
Mr. Lackner,
Yes.
Mr. Lentz,
Yes.
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
and Mrs. Fairgrave.
Yes, motion passes 7-0. Item B on our agenda is the District 303 5-year strategic plan. Do I have a motion to approve the District 303 5-year strategic plan?
So moved.
Thank you, Mrs. Bell. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mrs. McCabe. Any discussion at this time?
I want to thank Paul and the team for spending the time on the questions and concerns. I was very, very concerned about, a couple pieces in particular. And I think I got educated a little bit on some of the constraints that we have as a district and what the state requires from an evaluation perspective. But I do appreciate the additional clarifying language that you guys have put through. So thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Mr. Lentz. Anything else? Okay, Ms. Marsan, would you please take the roll call vote?
Mr. Lackner,
Yes.
Mr. Lentz,
Yes.
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
Mr. Kuschert,
Yes.
and Mrs. Fairgrave.
Yes, motion passes 7-0. Item C, St. Charles Transportation and Maintenance Contract, 2023 to 2027. Do I have a motion to approve the St. Charles Transportation and Maintenance Contract for the 2023 to 2024 through 2026, 2027 school years?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Lentz and Mr. Kuschert for the second. Is there any discussion at this time?
I'm just excited that we're not going to be incurring additional potentially $1.2 million of contractor costs to cover our bus routes. So
Very good point. All right, Ms. Marsan, would you please take the roll call vote?
Mr. Lentz,
yes.
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
Mr. Kuschert,
Yes.
Mr. Lackner,
Yes.
and Mrs. Fairgrave.
Yes, motion passes 7-0. Item D, St. Charles Educational Support Professionals Contract, 2023 through 2026. Do I have a motion to approve the St. Charles Education Support Professionals Contract for the 2023, 2024 through 2025, 2026 school years?
So moved.
Thank you, Mrs.
Second.
McCabe. Thank you, Mr. Kuschert, for the second. Any discussion on this item? Okay, Ms. Marsan, would you please take the roll call vote?
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
Mr. Kuschert,
Yes.
Mr. Lackner,
Yes.
Mr. Lentz,
Yes.
and Mrs. Fairgrave.
Yes, motion passes 7-0. Item E, District 303 Personnel Report. Do I have a motion to approve the District 303 Personnel Report?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Lentz. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mrs. McCabe. Any discussion at this time? Okay, Ms. Marsan, would you please take the roll call vote?
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
Mr. Kuschert,
Yes.
Mr. Lackner,
Yes.
Mr. Lentz,
Yes.
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
and Mrs. Fairgrave.
Yes, motion passes 7-0. Item F, the Mid-Valley Personnel Report. Do I have a motion to approve the Mid-Valley Personnel Report?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Lentz, and thank you, Mrs. McCabe, for the second. Any discussion at this time? Okay, Ms. Marsan, would you please take the roll call vote?
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
Mr. Kuschert,
Yes.
Mr. Lackner,
Yes.
Mr. Lentz,
Yes.
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
and Mrs. Fairgrave.
Yes, motion passes 7-0. Item G is the Marzano's Proficiency Scales. Do I have a motion to approve the purchase of Marzano's Proficiency Scales?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Lentz, for the first and Mrs. McCabe for the second. Is there any discussion at this time? Okay, Ms. Marsan, would you please take the roll call vote?
Mr. Kuschert,
Yes.
Mr. Lackner,
Yes.
Mr. Lentz,
Yes.
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
and Mrs. Fairgrave.
Yes, motion passes 7-0. Moving to item 4 on the agenda for closed session. Do I have a motion to adjourn to closed session for the purpose of the appointment, employment, compensation, discipline, performance, or dismissal of specific employees, specific individuals who serve as independent contractors in a park, recreational, or educational setting, or specific volunteers of the public body or legal counsel for the public body, including hearing testimony on a complaint lodged against an employee, a specific individual who serves as an independent contractor in a park, recreational, or educational setting, or a volunteer of the public body, or against legal counsel for the public body to determine its validity.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Lentz and Mr. Kuschert for the second. Any discussion or questions at this time? Okay, Ms. Marsan, would you please take the roll call vote?
Mr. Lackner,
Yes.
Mr. Lentz,
Yes.
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Mrs. Bell,
Yes.
Mr. Kuschert,
Yes.
and Mrs. Fairgrave.
Yes, motion passes 7-0. We will now adjourn to closed session at 7:12 PM.